Zachy his son as your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Hi folks, Zachy here. As we wrap up Star Trek month here at Nostalgia Theater, celebrating 50 years of one of the greatest multimedia franchises of all time, it's worth remembering that this isn't the only momentous Trek anniversary that this year has to offer. It also marks 15 years since the premiere of Star Trek Enterprise, or as it was known back then, Enterprise. Now, this show is a personal favorite of mine in the big, voluminous Trek canon, and it's one that doesn't really get its due, or at least it hasn't in the past. That's been my experience. Maybe this show is part of changing the trajectory of that conversation just a little bit. I hope so. So with that in mind, let's play some audio of Captain Jonathan Archer as he really sums up, I think, the mission statement of Star Trek Enterprise.
Up until about 100 years ago, there was one question that burned in every human, that made us study the stars and dream of traveling to them. Are we alone? Our generation is privileged to know the answer to that question. We are all explorers, driven to know what's over the horizon, what's beyond our own shores. Yet, the more I've experienced, the more I've learned that no matter how far we travel or how fast we get there, the most profound discoveries are not necessarily beyond that next star. They're within us, woven into the threads that bind us, all of us, to each other. The final frontier begins in this hall. Let's explore it together.
I gotta say, that clip still kind of gives me chills. And that's, by the way, that's from the 4th season episode Terra Prime. The prequel series, starring Scott Bakula as Captain Jonathan Archer, had a 4-season run in the early aughts that brought the curtain down on an amazing 18-year run of televised Trek. And while it had its ups and downs quality-wise during that short run, I do think Enterprise at its best deserves to be included among Star Trek's best. Now, my guest today is someone who was there on the ground for the majority of that time, and he's someone whose work I've admired for a pretty big chunk of my life. Joining me to discuss Enterprise's Big 1-5 to celebrate the unsung legacy of the NX-01 is none other than series co-creator Brannon Braga. From the time he joined the staff of Star Trek The Next Generation in 1990 to Enterprise's finale in 2005, Brannon wrote or co-wrote 104 Star Trek episodes and 2 features, more than any other writer in the franchise's history. And that record, by the way, is in no danger of being broken ever. Following that, he executive produced Fox's Terra Nova and Cosmos, and his current project is WGN Salem, which is now in its 3rd season. Brannon, thank you so much for coming on Nostalgia Theater. I am so honored.
Oh, it's my pleasure, man.
So I realized as I was doing my intro that this is also, and I don't know how this slipped my mind, it's also the 20th anniversary of Star Trek First Contact.
Wow, that's disturbing.
It's amazing how the years go by.
Yeah.
So before we talk about Enterprise, I mean, Star Trek First Contact was kind of the peak critically and commercially for the next generation era on the big screen. So I mean, that's got to be a big feather in your cap.
Well, it's a lot of feathers in a lot of caps. There were so many people worked so passionately on that movie and the series, but in terms of a cultural phenomenon, certainly Star Trek was at a peak. I mean, it was actually when Generations was released, Kirk and Picard were on the cover of Time magazine.
That's right.
And First Contact was an even bigger box office success and critical success. And I think, everything was humming along. That would not last, of course, but it was definitely a great time to be working on Star Trek for me personally.
I remember at the time Enterprise premiered, and this is fall of '01, I remember thinking, like, that's one of those jobs that you if you're an actor, you get on a Star Trek show and you've got 7 years. Like, it was just one of those things that I feel like, not just myself as a viewer, but I'm assuming you all behind the scenes were like, well, this is about as sure a thing as there is in the industry. Is that something that you felt?
Oh, no, I don't think anybody felt a sense of it. Some people might have assumed that. I certainly didn't.
Mm-hmm.
I've said this before. I think I speak for Rick Berman. We weren't in a hurry to do another one. But Voyager was leaving the air, and the studio and the network felt that there was room for another incarnation. And the pressure that I felt was, having just produced 11 seasons of 2 different Star Trek shows, making this one sufficiently different yet familiar in all the right ways, and the storytelling fresh, and that was the challenge.
And so, I mean, in terms of the timeline, I think you've said before that at the end of the 6th season of Voyager, you were asked by Rick Berman to co-create Enterprise. Do I have the timeline right?
Yes, you do.
So he came to you and said, "We've got a prequel." How concrete was it beyond that? Was it like, we're going to do a show, it's called Enterprise, or was it just all you had was the when?
As I recall, there wasn't a lot of detail. It was really the idea of doing a show, and prequels weren't, to my recollection, there weren't a lot of prequels at that time.
Yeah.
I don't remember. Phantom Menace had come out, right?
Yeah, just a couple years before.
But it seemed, that setting something in Picard's time would be a mistake, because we'd just done 3 shows. Collectively, 21 seasons of material in that time period.
Right.
In retrospect, I think we could have done another. It's a very fertile time period for Star Trek. But and then there was, I think the studio really wanted to go more in the future, even past Picard's time.
So like 50 years ahead.
Something.
Yeah.
And you start to wonder what that means. What are the uniforms tighter? Are the phasers smaller? What does future mean? Probably not much. I think Rick's initial impulse to go back to the roots of Star Trek with characters that are even more closely related to us than even Kirk's people were, and to examine the human Vulcan dynamic that we actually had talked about as far back as Star Trek First Contact,
Right.
As being these people who said, you have warp drive, welcome to the club. We're going to babysit you for a while to make sure you're ready. I really loved that aspect of Enterprise. By the way, I'm going off on a tangent now.
No,
So.
it's a very fruitful tangent. I mean, I think that for me, when I think of that, what you're describing sounds like, for example, the episode First Flight.
Yeah.
And you've described before the idea was kind of the right stuff meets Star Trek. I mean, to me, that episode is almost like the quintessence of what you're describing.
Yeah, definitely. It wasn't, and I've said publicly before, it wasn't as gritty and earthbound as we wanted it to be. And this temporal Cold War aspect, which was an idea I had for possibly another television show, still could be one, we put in to kind of compromise with the studio who really wanted a show set in the future. So we thought, well, this show's set in the past. This is set during the beginnings of modern Star Trek. But we're going to also include a sequel, something in the future. Never quite gelled the way that we hoped it would, or at least certainly the way I hoped. We were far more interested in, people wearing tennis shoes and ball caps and talking more like we talk and making mistakes. The Trip character was good. Think of an episode like Cogenitor.
Sure.
And I think, well, that's a really good episode, and it's only an episode you could do on Enterprise, and that was always the goal. Why is this an Enterprise episode? And we weren't always successful, particularly in that first season.
Well, but when I look at that first season, I mean, I think first of all, and I just rewatched the pilot last night, as I was prepping to talk to you, and I have to say, I mean, out of all of the modern Trek, actually, you know what? Out of all of the Trek series pilots, that's the one I can look at and see most fully formed the series that would come after. I mean, the characters, their dynamics, their personalities, everything is there, as opposed to, like Encounter at Farpoint, you watch it, and, things are in a state of flux because the show was very much, the show was in a state of flux at that time. And so, I definitely, to me, that's a strength, is that you guys launched with a clear sense of what the show that aired was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I appreciate you saying that. I think I disagree with you a little bit.
Okay.
In that I think the Deep Space Nine pilot was really solid.
Sure.
And I think that the Voyager pilot
was also that was indicative of the show too, absolutely.
But there was something about Enterprise that I thought had it had kind of a little bit of a personality of its own, and the characters, I hope, were vivid.
Yeah.
I hope so. I mean, we really wanted to, capture the wonder and terror and all of the things that you would feel if you were the first human warp-bound ship.
Well, and with that in mind, I mean, worth pointing out here, obviously, I think a key part of the show's effectiveness, and in case it isn't clear, folks, I'm a big fan of Enterprise. I've made it a one-man crusade practically over the past 10 years to get people to watch it, because obviously, a lot of Trek fans had sort of written it off, and I think to their, it's their loss. So I hope they are checking it out. But Captain Archer, Scott Bakula, first of all, is he just a prince among men? Because to the one, every single person who talks about Scott Bakula talks about him in terms that are like, I wish people would describe me that way.
Yeah, he's a leader. So, the captains set the pace and the tone on that set. They're playing the captain, but they are the captain.
Right.
And Scott was wonderful. And, I had a really good working relationship with Scott. And, we really kind of worked together a lot. I did see him he got pissed off at me at least one time, and that was the final episode, which he and other cast members were really upset about.
Sure.
Because it really wasn't about them as much as it should have been. But no, he was a great guy.
Well, and now what strikes me is that, and I remember at the time the internet not being as prevalent as it is now in terms of just having access to information by the minute. But I mean, certainly Star Trek on the internet was I would say Star Trek fans were earlier on the internet than probably the rest of the right.
Oh, absolutely! Like forefront.
Which I mean, I guess in hindsight, that makes all the sense in the world,
To discuss television shows, what else would there have been at the time?
Right.
Star Trek was an early, they were in there. I was reading stuff, when Voyager was still in there. I mean, there were I don't know how long TrekToday.com has been around, or if it's still there, but they reviewed Voyager episodes as they came out.
Oh wow! So we're talking like mid-90s.
No, it wasn't mid-90s. It was, unless I'm totally misremembering, it was toward the end of the run.
Okay, so early 2000s.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I can only imagine what it must have been like for you to be because I mean, this isn't telling tales out of school. I mean, Star Trek fans can be very, I guess, possessive. Is that very? I was going to say persnickety, but I think possessive might be the better word.
Or I would say, yep. Well, rightfully so.
Sure.
They're just opinionated.
Yeah.
People have strong opinions.
But I mean,
nothing wrong with that.
No, absolutely. But I mean, for you, was that just like, were you just at some point like, can you give us room to work here?
No, I mean, I enjoyed in those early days of the internet reading reviews the day after the show aired. And sometimes, nowadays, like on the show I do, Salem, the review will have the episode will be done airing, and there'll be reviews.
Right.
So they're obviously writing them while the show's happening. I really liked it. There was a lot. There was vitriol.
Yeah.
And there, it's funny, and it seems to me there was a lot more vitriol in the early days of the internet.
Sure.
It's like the only people that were getting on there were like maybe
the angriest.
Yeah, for whatever reason, and it's definitely evolved into a more sophisticated discussion. But it was, I didn't mind it.
Yeah.
It was discouraging if you. I mean, look, we knew when we had a good episode.
Okay.
It's not. It's like when a mediocre episode went out, it just didn't quite come together. I knew what the reaction would be. I think I'd been doing Star Trek long enough that I never was like completely shocked by reactions. I guess the only time I was really surprised there was when Enterprise took so much flack, and I really look at it as, if you like Star Trek and you haven't seen it, there's some really good Star Trek in there. The people who made Next Generation were making this show. And there are some really amazing episodes in there. If you like Star Trek, you're missing out, because they're new episodes. I have my cousin from Ohio was a Voyager fan. That was his first exposure to Star Trek. That's what he watched. He doesn't watch any of the other ones. He re-watches Voyager. Now that's not, by the way, that I think is probably not so uncommon.
Sure. Depending
what Star Trek you bonded with. But I forced him to start watching Enterprise, and he loved it.
Right.
But there was definitely a much more of a wave of negativity from the fan base about Enterprise. A lot of it justified, in that we weren't quite delivering on its promise every week, which I'll take responsibility for. But there was one person who really hated Enterprise who went back and said, if you look at Braga's other episodes, none of them are, if you really look at them, they all suck.
Wow.
And I'm like, wow, there's revisionist history. Thanks.
I mean, that's kind of my point, Brannon, is that like to just get shit on by these really overzealous fans. I mean, I couldn't do it,
Oh, it comes with the territory.
Yeah.
I welcome even the most vitriolic criticism. There might be something valid in there, at least that I perceive to be valid. So it got it did get pretty heavy there.
Yeah.
There was a time when I was being in the trenches, discouraged. But in retrospect, it's part of the job,
Sure.
and it's you can't ignore the fan. You can't ignore the internet. It's what I mean.
Yeah.
Like if you're going to read reviews of critics, you got to read the fans.
Sure, and you take the good with the bad.
Yeah.
In terms of the show, now from my recollection is that the premiere got really, I mean, it did very well ratings wise. And that first year, I remember you were on the cover of Entertainment Weekly. I mean, it was heralded initially as kind of, hey, Star Trek is back, or something to that effect. Certainly in the media.
It never left.
Right, but I mean, certainly the media narrative.
Yeah. It was, the show was actually got some good press initially.
Yeah.
The pilot, I think, got some good reviews, and it wasn't. It was far from a disaster.
Right.
The premiere did really well, and the ratings tapered off, which is not uncommon with any show, including Star Trek. But the show was never a ratings bomb.
Right.
And
So at what point then does this question start coming up? Like, or the network starts getting involved, and there's the question of, will we be back? I mean, at how far into, was it during the first year? Was it during the second year? When did that start becoming a going concern?
I think the second year there was a huge change. CBS came in, and I don't know what the details of the business merger or whatever it was, but the regime that we'd been working with since the Next Gen days at Paramount was all replaced. And I'm not sure the people we were dealing with at the network, the new people, I don't really want to speak for them. It's just my perception was I don't know that they entirely understood or even liked Star Trek, or that it even fit with what they saw as the new ethos of the network. And so I kind of felt like, you know what? And I think it was the second season. I'm pretty sure that happened. By the third season, we were calling it Star Trek Enterprise, right?
That's correct. Yeah, a couple episodes in.
Yeah. So, what season was it that do you remember that Reed was walking on the hull of the ship, like on a minefield or something?
I want to say that's season 2.
Yeah. So that's around the time that the regime change happened, and it was a good kick in the pants too, and it allowed, we were told to shake things up in the third season, and we were finally able to do something that we'd been wanting to do, or I'd been wanting to do for a long time, is tell a serialized story. In Voyager, there's a 2-parter that Joe Manosky and I wrote called Year of Hell. Well, we pitched that as a season thing. Mm-hmm. Like, let's do the Year of Hell, the whole season. And that was just like, there was no serialized shows on TV other than daytime soap operas.
Sure.
So that was poo-pooed. But then in the third season, they kind of let us go and do what we wanted. But by the fourth season, we knew that there was just the vibe from the network wasn't great, and the ratings weren't stellar enough to warrant a very expensive show to make.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine that if we'd still had the regime that helped us launch the show, it probably would have lasted 7 seasons. That's my guess.
Yeah. That's one of those great unknowables almost. Like it's like you wonder, let's wander down that alternate reality and see how things turned out there.
Yep.
It's like, well, apes have taken over, but Enterprise lasted all 7 years, Talking about the third season, I'm a big fan of the Xindi arc, and I tell people the show, I think it's almost like it arrived just at this sort of nexus point, if you'll pardon the expression, where we started seeing television going in that direction, in the heavily serialized continuing, where it's like, forget syndication, let's go for DVD kind of. approach. So it's almost Enterprise is like right in the middle of that, where you can see seasons 1 and 2, and then season 3 and 4 are an indication of where television had sort of taken that shift.
Yeah, I mean, to my recollection, it was the only major show doing serialization was 24.
Right.
And that's the show we talked about. Like, we're not going to do it in real time, but, we pitched a seasonal arc that we pretty much had figured out.
And the arc was, I mean, it was in essence sort of a response to 9/11, right? Is that a fair assessment?
I think in part it was inspired by that. Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's this in writing, there's this notion of timeliness and timelessness, and you want something that's of the moment, but not so of the moment that when you're looking at it years removed, that you have no relation to it. And I feel like the Xindi storyline in that sense, that's partially why it holds up so well, is because at the time, I mean, obviously it was just 2 years removed from these events, so we could see the connective tissue in the same way. For example, I'm trying to think of another Star Trek. Oh, the Star Trek 6, where it was about Glasnost.
Yeah.
But I mean, when you watch it now, I mean, I went through and watched the third season with my kids, who, I mean, they were born several years after 9/11, and for them it was no less gripping and engrossing, completely separate from the real world context that sort of birthed the storyline.
We were careful not. 24 had already kind of embodied the TV show that kind of they own 9/11.
Sure.
They own terrorism, and
even though the show itself started, I mean, it was filmed and everything before September 11th happened.
Oh no, I know.
Yeah.
I know. It was just one of those weird coincidences, but I'd always liked the idea of a planet where multiple species evolved intelligence and culture. It just seemed like a cool idea I'd never seen before, and would need a larger narrative canvas to explore. And there were themes that I've hit on Star Trek before. There's a kind of a episode where it's not just 9/11. It's about attacks. It's an episode that dealt with kind of the Oppenheimer of the Xindi,
right?
And the guy who built the weapon, and the moral and immoral aspects of that. There were other things going on that season, but it gave the crew a purpose. I really loved T'Pol's storyline that year, where she became addicted.
Yeah.
Trillium D, I think it was.
That's right.
Which I don't know. I thought it was. I don't remember it all, but I thought it was a compelling season. I thought the last 4 episodes were like epic.
Well, and you mentioned 24. I mean, it definitely, there's that sense of like, oh my gosh, I got to see what happens next. Especially once I think that the one of the final shots in I believe the episode is called 0 Hour, where it's this great shot of Scott Bakula running towards the camera with the explosions behind him. I mean, to me, that's like that's our hero. That's the hero shot.
Yeah, for sure. I remember that.
I think in terms of the third season, I think you would agree that was sort of, it felt like everything was coming together in terms of you'd found your footing. I mean, is that how you were feeling behind the scenes?
I think we had something new that we'd never done, that we wanted to try and were never allowed to try, and that was really creatively galvanizing. But Manny Cotto was a game changer.
Sure.
And he really just brought so much talent and passion to the table, obviously because we handed him the reins of season 4.
Well, and I want to talk about that in just a second, but before you mentioned the writing staff. Now, before Enterprise, there had been an open submission policy, is that right? And that was instituted by Michael Piller, I believe?
Yes.
So in my mind, I picture like Big Block of Cheese Day on the West Wing, where people just kind of come in and I would assume that there was a lot of maybe not so great pitches that you sort of had to wade through to get through some of the good ones.
Well, the script submission, open script thing was shut down at some point. I don't remember when.
Yeah.
But I shut that down at some point.
And that was my question. Yeah, I mean, with
you
Enterprise, you didn't.
It was getting to the point where there were just a lot of, as I recall, people who thought we stole their ideas, and it was more trouble than it was worth. It just was kind of not quite working anymore. But we still took pitches from professional writers who came into the office and pitched.
From established writers.
Yeah, but some not established. Like,
sure.
There was a writer named Brian Fuller who came in to Voyager.
And whatever happened to that guy?
Yeah, what happened to that guy? He was pretty new at the time. He hadn't done anything yet.
So essentially, it had to be the right pitch if you were going to get through the door, basically.
Well, no, I mean, the entire writing staff took pitches continuously.
Okay.
I rarely, at that point in my Star Trek career, I would just listen to the pitches that staffers had heard that they thought were cool and would bring to me.
Right.
You can take pitches on a show like Star Trek because the episodes are standalone episodes. The Xindi season was a little trickier.
Yeah, there's a few standalones in there, but I mean, on the whole, it's a pretty contiguous whole.
Yes.
So season 3, and you mentioned Manny Coto, and I believe it was Manny Coto who wrote Similitude.
Yeah, really good episode.
Oh my gosh, I think I would put that up there as among the best Star Treks ever. I think it's fantastic.
It's funny. It brings a tear to your eye at the end.
It really does. And I think what I really like about that episode is it gives us maybe our clearest sense up to that moment of just how stripped raw Archer has become throughout this sort of extended mission, where he's no longer the sort of real naive almost character that we meet in the beginning of the show.
Definitely.
So Manny Coto comes on. Now you had been showrunner for the first 3 years.
Yes.
Were you looking for an off ramp in terms of the day-to-day grind?
No, not necessarily. But I can't remember what made me decide not to do the 4th season. Mm-hmm. I think I just saw that Manny was the right person to take over. I mean, I'd been doing Star Trek at that point for 14 seasons. Yeah. It was like, here's this guy who is going to kill it, and I wish Manny had been on the first season of the show. Season 4 is probably what season 1 should have been.
Well, in what sense? I mean, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I don't know. It seemed to really please the fans, and it dealt with Star Trek, iconic Star Trek concepts like the mirror universe and Wrath of Khan people, and I don't know. It just seemed, and eventually we were going to do Romulan War,
right?
Season 5. I don't know. It just seemed to have a prequel vibe that was much more just vivid and bold than I had.
Now, in the past, you had said, and I'm going on memory, so forgive me if I get this wrong, but in the early '90s, you almost, as like a badge of honor, you talked about you're not having watched the original series. Was that you playing up a role, or was that actually the case?
Well, that was my I don't know if I was just being a jerk. I thought there was a nice irony in it.
Sure.
But it was not perceived that way, and a lot of fans were like, who the hell is this guy?
Yeah.
How dare he? By the way, don't blame him at all.
Sure.
And, I very quickly realized that I had screwed up. But, years later, of course, I saw an interview that J.J. Abrams had never really watched Star Trek that much, and nobody seemed to care. But, of course, eventually I would see all of the Star Treks. But I was seeing something as a bad guy.
Yeah, I remember, Brannon Braga, he's Trek's bad boy. Like, I remember stuff like that.
Yeah, me too. I fomented that.
Uh-huh.
I certainly didn't fight it, but I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
I was young and brash, and feels like 1,000 years ago.
Well, you alluded to the series finale, and you mentioned how it caused some sparks with you and the cast. I mean, and this is we're 10 years later. At this point, you've heard all the arguments. But I mean, I'm curious. Obviously, you didn't go in to piss anybody off, and you've said before you wanted it to be a Valentine to Star Trek. So, what was the goal, and where do you think you might have gone off the rails on that goal?
Well, the rationale at the time was Manny Cotto had just done this amazing 3-parter, mm-hmm. and we thought, okay, Enterprise had a great climax of its own. Rick and I said, let's do a Valentine to Star Trek as a whole. We've been here 15 and 18 years respectively. Star Trek is a broad canvas. I personally thought that the idea of doing the final episode of Enterprise as a lost Next Generation episode that we never saw, mm-hmm. that had Enterprise as a holodeck adventure I thought that was a cool concept. Apparently, I was the only one.
Sure.
Because people weren't happy, and there wasn't much I could do about it at that point. And killing Trip in retrospect, I think was pretty stupid. I think killing Trip in some ways was I had wanted to kill 7 of 9 in the finale of Voyager, mm-hmm. as this great tragedy, her helping getting the crew home and sacrificing her life. I actually think that would have been hugely impactful.
I agree with you now that you say that. Yeah, absolutely.
Because she was a tragic figure. She could never really be human. We learned that. She had implants in her that prevented her from even feeling anything.
Right.
So she's kind of this person, who didn't want to go back to the Borg and could never be human, and would give her life to get Janeway and the crew home. I think there wouldn't have been a dry eye in the house.
Yeah.
But Trip, no one wants Trip to die. Why is Trip dying? So I think the whole episode, I'd probably avoided watching it again because I'm worried I'm going to squirm through it. And I do regret it. Some people say they like it, but I don't know.
I mean, I think that I'm curious what the fan upset is, if there is any, because I can see from the actor's perspective. I get that. I remember Jolene Blaylock at the time. I think she said she was appalled by it or something. I can understand that perspective. I'm curious what it was that the fans were, that upset about. Because I mean, I watched it and I said, well, I mean, it's the last episode, and we're realistically not going to see these characters again. And this is as good an ending as any. As they sort of go off into the, and I think I guess I look at it from these multiple perspectives, because I'm kind of like, what were the fans upset about here? What was the crux of there? And maybe that's something that you don't have any insight into necessarily, but
I think there was just a lot of disgruntlement with the show in general. I think that some of the creative shortcomings were mine.
Sure.
In the supervising of the writing. I think there were also some great triumphs, which, by the way, same with the other ones. Now, I mean, when you're doing 26 a year, man, it's brutal.
Which is nuts, by the way, because that's a fossil that does not exist in today's TV landscape.
Wait, I was reading about the Twilight Zone the other day, and there was how I don't know, but their episodes are like 35 episodes.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, 35 episodes, but that's what most people today would say about 26 episodes. We had to crank those scripts out every week. Yeah. It wasn't easy, man. Yeah. Even with great writing staffs, it was challenging. Anyway, but I do think the show got unfairly treated. I think I do really feel that Star Trek had been on for too long.
Yeah.
And there comes a point when you say, here's another one.
Sure.
Here's another Star Trek. Here's another CSI.
It's like, how can I miss you if you won't go away?
Exactly. At some point, there is franchise fatigue, and people feel like they're seeing the same thing, and so I think there were several factors. I can't even remember what the question was. Oh, and the cast. Not every cast member on every series was happy to be part of it. And Jolene Blaylock was obviously not happy to be there.
Yeah.
Now, she and I, and by the way, there were times that I wasn't happy to be there,
Sure.
but she and I have made up since then, but our relationship at the time was strained. She didn't like the character, and I couldn't figure it out because I really felt the character. I thought not only was the character a really good character, that she was actually doing a really good job.
Yeah.
So I couldn't figure it out. So, of course, when the final episode came out, she got pretty nasty in some interviews.
Yeah. I mean, I remember that. And I remember, there were people protesting at Paramount to get it back. And I mean, was there any serious consideration of finding the show another home, or was that all just pie in the sky and it was, well, this is it. It's the end of the ride?
I don't remember. I don't think we tried to shop it anywhere.
Uh-huh.
At that point, no, not to my recollection. What was interesting, though, was when the show was first being developed, we had other suitors. NBC wanted it.
Wow. You wonder, would that have been better or worse for the show?
Don't know.
I
don't know. I really don't. I just don't know.
I mean, it's, from what you're describing, it definitely, I mean, the film, Star Trek Nemesis had not done so well. I mean, it definitely felt like...
Oh, wait, that didn't help.
Right. I mean, the franchise fatigue you were talking about, if the next generation, if people weren't even showing up to see them, then maybe franchise fatigue is a real thing.
Well, I also think that, I mean, I don't know how, I haven't seen Nemesis in a while, but I don't think Nemesis and Insurrection were quite up to the standards of what the audience had gotten used to.
Yeah.
And it's...
Nemesis, I think, I mean, I remember at the time being like, this is not a good ending for these characters.
No. No, it wasn't. Look, I wasn't involved in the movie, and I don't want to.
Yeah, right.
Poop on it, but I don't think it was all that great. And one of my career regrets, and it's a big one, is that I didn't work with Rick on the movie after First Contact.
Sure.
I didn't feel I could do it because I was running Voyager, but I should have. I'm not saying I would have made a better movie.
Right.
But we were riding high off First Contact, and they were, I don't know, I made a bad decision.
Well, and I mean, like you said, I think both of those latter two Next Generation films, it certainly, for me, from the outside looking in, it felt a little like, I don't know, resting on your laurels a little bit. Like that was my sense, like I can watch Insurrection and just be like, oh, it's like an adventure with the crew, but I don't know, with the I always feel like a movie. Why are we here? Why are we at the movies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
And I mean, I don't want to go down.
John Logan was, he's an Oscar-winning screenwriter when he wrote Nemesis, and I know this isn't a podcast about Nemesis. I just what I took issue with although it is relevant,
it is.
I think it didn't help things. I felt that John's approach to the characters was, he almost was writing first season versions of these characters.
Wow. Okay.
And if you look at it, it's got stuff in there like Imzadi. Like, I had phased Imzadi out years ago. I hated that shit.
Right.
And the Troy Riker thing, and know, I don't know, man. It
Yeah.
just something wasn't working.
And obviously the timing, like you said, the timing could not have been worse in terms of sort of bringing the whole brand down a little bit, because that arrived right in the middle of Enterprise's second season, and then from the second season on, I remember articles. It was like the polar opposite of what we were seeing season one. Now it's like, can Star Trek be saved? And oh, it's time to let it go. And like it, fickle. The fickleness of the press coverage was what stood out to me.
Yeah. It's funny because all these years later, I talk to people like you, or the last convention I appeared at in London a couple of years ago, I saw more Enterprise outs than anything.
Wow.
Like it had a huge presence. Like, I guess they didn't get word in England this sucks.
Well, so I mean, given what you just said, I'm going to ask a simple question that requires more of a nuanced answer. But when you look at it, do you look at Enterprise as a success or a failure?
That's a really good question. I mean, in some ways, I would have to say a failure, in that it didn't go. I mean, look, it went 99 episodes. That's a lot of episodes. Some shows today go 4 seasons. Battlestar Galactica went 4 seasons.
Yeah.
The TV's different now, but back then, I couldn't help but feel like it was a failure, and that the fans did not respond to it. And they were drifting away, and we got canceled before our time, just when the show was kind of reaching a creative apex.
Yeah.
So in that regard, it's a monumental failure. But having said that, I'm really proud of the show, and I think it's a good quality show. And I'm working on a project now that has some very Star Trek-like aspects. So I've been watching Enterprise, and I'm watching Enterprise because it was the most sophisticated of the shows from a production point of view. I mean, it's very cutting edge, and I'm thinking, wow, this show looked great. And I'm like, wow, there were some really good things that we did here. Always, it was certainly. I beat myself up a lot. I think on the Enterprise DVD interview that I did,
Yeah.
I come off practically suicidal. But it was, I was with Star Trek a long time. I loved Star Trek. I still love Star Trek. I miss Star Trek. And it's, took up most of my adult life. I channeled everything I had into that show.
Yeah.
And it was painful to be, kind of assaulted and told that what I was doing was crappy.
Yeah.
I'd be lying if I said it didn't get into my head. But enough time has passed now that I look at the show as a success, in that it had a wonderful cast. I still think it had a good premise, and there are some classic episodes in there. There's some really good, uniquely Enterprise episodes: Similitude, Cogenitor, Dear Doctor,
Yeah.
and others.
Do you think that obviously the availability of the show via streaming portals has been kind of the after the fact lifeblood that it really needed to get kind of a second look?
Oh, without question.
Yeah.
I mean, it pops up on my Netflix from time to time. I'm not sure why. But I think people are probably watching it. I mean, that could be said of a lot of shows.
Sure. I think when.
By the way, is Star Trek on Netflix? Someone told me all of Star Trek was gone from Netflix.
As far as I know, for sure, Deep Space, Voyager, Next Gen, and Enterprise are on. I don't recall seeing the original series recently, but those 4 are for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think they are being phased out, and I know that something to do with CBS All Access and that stuff.
They're probably going to put all of Star Trek there.
Yeah, which wouldn't surprise me. I mean, from a business standpoint, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I was, and with that in mind, I mean, I think that in a sense, for a show like Enterprise, it can't truly be a failure in the sense that it goes away and it'll never be seen, right? By virtue of being encompassed in this mega franchise, it will always be a part of the conversation in a way that other canceled series aren't necessarily.
It's true, and I do think that the show has been accepted into Star Trek canon.
Yeah.
It is part of the fabric of this kind of jaw-dropping shared history, fictional history we all share.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
I go to Star Trek conventions. I just look at all these thousands of people and think every single one of these people knows I mean, they have this shared history that they are conversant in, and it's really cool. And Star Trek is Enterprise is part of that history.
Yeah.
And
it's part of both histories, by the way, even in the new rebooted films.
It's referenced.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, when you're in the trenches and you're in the thick of it, and you're just trying to make the best show you can, it's only with some and with some time, and it's been over 10 years since it went off the air. I think it was a really good show.
Yeah.
And I hope people who haven't seen it will give it a shot. It's because just like I told my cousin, dude, you say you love Star Trek. There are 99 episodes of Star Trek.
There's a whole bunch of Star Trek.
Like you've seen there's a whole bunch check it out.
Well, you may or may not remember this, but a few months ago I sent you a picture that via Facebook that my kids drew of a chalk drawing of the Enterprise, and they wrote Captain Archer's ship.
Yeah, I think I remember that. Yeah.
And my kids at the time, they were 8 and 7, or 8 and 6, and for them, that's they don't look at it in terms of continuity, this and canon, that, and everything else. They're just like, this is the show that I know, this is the show that I love, and I think that's something that's going to carry forward.
Well, I hope you're right. I mean, look, it's true, and this new Star Trek, Brian Fuller's, will undoubtedly be the Star Trek of another generation.
Can we look forward to you contributing to that?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm doing other stuff.
Yeah.
For 20th Century Fox, and I did that show for a long time.
Yeah.
I do miss the storytelling, and I am. Don't be. You're going to see some more science fiction from me next year. Mm-hmm. But whether or not I would go back, I'm not saying I would never do it. But right now, no, I'm not involved. And by the way, plenty of people will be happy to do that.
Well, I'm definitely not one of them. I do want to, as we wrap things up here, we're recording just a couple days after the very sad passing of Anton Yelchin, who played Chekhov in the rebooted films. And by the way, I just met him a couple months ago for Green Room. And just a nicer guy you couldn't imagine. So I mean, it hit me like a ton of bricks. But seeing the reaction online, I was struck by a tweet that Jonathan Frakes put out, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, "We've had a death in the family."
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me that that's what this is for everybody who's involved in this mammoth franchise and who's been involved from 1966 until now. Everyone who's had a little piece of skin in the game, you get to be part of this amazing family.
I can't think of a more beautiful way to say it, and you're right on. I remember feeling that very same way when I was in London when all the captains were there. It's the first time ever on stage that all the captains, and there were tons of cast members there. And I remember being in the green room thinking, we're all family. We share a unique experience that we were part of Star Trek. And it's really cool. It's really, really cool. And I'm only now kind of realizing, I did do a lot of Star Trek. Like, wow, I did have an impact on that show, for some good, some bad, and the kind of breadth of the work is honestly only striking me now.
Yeah.
Many years later.
Well, and with that, I mean, with the passage of time, do you feel like a proud grandparent, or when as you see sort of how the franchise has proliferated following your tenure was not insubstantial, and in a very real way you were part of the fabric of what kept that, if you'll pardon the pun, enterprise humming along, from next gen all the way through.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, look, I wrote over 100 episodes, I produced over 300. That's a lot of TV, and it's a lot of Star Trek, and I'm really happy I did it. I'm proud of it. I think what J.J. Abrams did just kind of demonstrated that it was time for a new voice. Mm-hmm. And Star Trek is a vast narrative enterprise, and it's had a lot of voices over the years. Mine may have been more long-lasting than most, but it's I think it's a good thing that Brian Fuller is doing the new one. He's a real visionary, and he's a real Star Trek fan.
And he's been wanting to do it for a while.
Yeah, he has. He's been lobbying to do it, and he's the perfect guy.
So I'm sure for you, given that you're not going to be involved, for you part of the excitement is just getting to watch it as a fan. Star Trek as a viewer.
Look, I'd be lying if I said I didn't. I know a thing or two about what they're doing. Sure. I can't. I definitely. I'm not going to wait till it gets on the air. Having said that, at this point, I am really no longer working on Star Trek, but I'm a Star Trek fan.
Well, and that's a great place to leave our conversation. Brannon, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks. I can't believe an hour went by. It's like crazy.
And as I said at the start, I'm sitting here pinching myself that I got to sort of shoot the breeze with you.
Thanks, man.
And with that, we put a bow on Star Trek Month here at Nostalgia Theater. This has certainly been a treat for me, getting to talk to these luminaries and good friends. Hopefully they've been as much fun for you to listen to as they've been for me to participate in. I'm still kind of pinching myself a little bit for being able to have this opportunity. You can find Salem on WGN. That's Brandon's current series. And as for the Nostalgia Theater show, leave us a review at iTunes. Leave a star rating. Let people know if you dig the show, why you dig it, and spread the word, because every little bit helps. You can hit like on the Facebook page for the Movie Film Podcast. That's facebook.com/moviefilmpodcast. And as for me, you can find me at my website, zackiscorner.com. That's ZAKIS Corner. That's also my Twitter handle. That's also my Instagram handle. You can also find me at the Huffington Post, where my movie reviews go up regularly, as does this show, as does the Movie Film Show. That's it for this episode, but we'll be back very shortly. Got another fun one in the pipeline I think you're going to dig. Thanks for listening.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its continuing mission:
to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations,
to boldly go where no man has gone before.